I am delighted to be talking to Peter Phillips, the founding conductor of the world-famous choral ensemble, the Tallis Scholars. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for agreeing to share some of your views and experiences with us.
Thanks, Nick. Great pleasure.
2020 was a year of anniversaries for both of us. 50 years of the Calgary Renaissance singers and players, and 40 years since the release of the Tallis Scholars' first recording of Allegri's famous Miserere, Palestrina's Pape Marcellimas, and William Mundy's Vox Patris Celestis. The Tallis Scholars were one of several professional musical ensembles that were founded in the early 1970s, the majority of which are no longer in existence. To what do you attribute your longevity?
Well, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that straight off, because I don't want to create a bad atmosphere or seem like a bogeyman. But I mean, to be honest, the straightforward answer is that I sacked people. I got rid of the singers who, over the years, were not doing what I wanted them to do. It's a hard truth, but I mean, we are talking about nearly 50 years here, so I think it's sort of fair. I mean, there are other, you know, that sounds terrible. It sounds as though I was being horrid to my friends and all that sort of thing. But I might come on to that relationship between conductor and singers in a moment. But there were other reasons, you know. I always thought that those groups that started in the early 70s, that were the early music sort of pioneers, the revolutionaries, as they were called, tended to fail after about 20 years. And there are reasons for this, obviously. They tended to start out as groups of friends from music college, and they found a repertoire which they liked to do. And they found a new way of doing it that was part of the revolutionary movement, which is what we're talking about with the early music revival. And after about 20 years, the exciting founding spirit waned, and new groups came along and did that music in a new way, and the public moved on to the new groups, basically. And then this group of friends tended to fall out with themselves. What they lacked was a dictator like me. That's what it took. I mean, I hoped I was a benign dictator, but it was my position. I could do it. I could keep the thing alive by standing aside from the actual booking of people. They were my employees, really, not my friends. It's hard, slightly hard truth there, but that's sort of what it took. And of course, I'd set up a repertoire which was much wider, actually, than some of these instrumental groups that started in the early 70s. I mean, they'd found a way of doing a narrow thing very well, but they got stuck in fads, you know. I mean, there were so many fads going on and have gone on ever since. You want to avoid the fads. And I set out to do something that I hoped would last much longer than the latest fad. I think we're going to touch on the fads in a minute. But anyway, I wanted to do, right from the start, I wanted to do something that might well last longer than me, but that had a sort of classic element that would last, that people would want in 50 years' time. And actually, that's what we're talking about.
I think I understand, and it certainly leads to my next question. As I understand it, you were originally inspired by the sound of David Woolston's Clerks of Oxenford ensemble and their performance of English Tudor music. And I think that a non-expert would be hard-pressed to identify a change in sound or in style in the Tallis recordings since that first recording. From your perspective, what is the essential core, and what, if anything, has changed?
Well, the simple answer to that one is that very little has changed, except that I've kind of refined through experience and through getting better and better singers interested in what I want. I've been able to refine the sound. I sang in the Clerks of Oxenford twice in the middle 70s. It wasn't a great success. but I got inside that sound. I sang next to a bass who was just the best singer I've ever come across. I mean, he became a priest. The trouble with amateur groups is that people wander off and do something else to make money. But we're talking about real amateur world here.
Yes.
This is the 70s. Come on. I mean, it was only in the 80s that we got professional. We did. And the Clarks by that time had more or less disappeared. But I got that sound in my head. And although I realize now that it was only partially what I wanted, should we say, at the time it seemed like heaven on earth. I mean, it was so much better than anything that was going on at the time. I just couldn't believe it. I was in heaven. We listened to I sang in, or anyway, heard Tallis's Gaudi Gloriosa, which I'm going to play for you later, some of it. And I just went home in a sort of daze. I was in a daze for about a week, wondering what had hit me. And I mean, I wanted to recreate that sound for myself. And what happened was that I borrowed some of the singers, and it wasn't as good, of course, because Woolston really knew what he was doing in his own field. And it then took me, well, many years, decades even, to refine the sound that I'd picked up in my head in those days. And I've said many times actually that I got an ideal sound world into my head. And it was a vision of beauty, really. People get terribly restive when you talk about beauty. They can't bear it. They think there's got to be something more than just beauty. But to me, beauty was enough. And the beauty of that sound stuck there. And I would truthfully say that every time I've gone on stage since then, I've been trying to recapture and recreate and refine that sound. And I suppose it's true to say this, I've got nearer and nearer to it as the years have gone by, because the singers that I replaced, who'd sung for me for 25 years, I mean, they were really good. That's why we're anywhere at all these days. They were good in those days. But the new people coming in are young, and their voices are younger, fresher voices, and singing is a muscular activity, and as you get older, it gets weaker. That's just how it is. I'm justifying myself now.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know. I've got to hang up about this, but in the year 2000, which was only 20 years ago or so, I was the 5th oldest member of the group. Now I'm by far the oldest member of the group. So you can see that I'm working alongside young people, and well, there are very many advantages. I don't need to tell you that the enthusiasm, the ability just to do things has meant that the sound has got better, and the average sound has got better. You can do what you like on recordings, incidentally. You can massage recordings so that you can have pretty well what you like. I mean, you can correct the tuning, you can, and all the rest of it. And the entries can be made better and all, so you do it sort of 10 times and you get one that works. You can't do that in concert. And it's the average standard in concert, I think, that defines a group's real ability. And that's what people won't know this, because you won't have an overall view of how the concerts have gone over all these years, but the average standard has gone up. And I think I'm finding that what I'm saying is that I'm finding that ideal sound more often. And well, just to be actual about it, with this lockdown, I didn't hear the group for 7 months last year, and I only heard them once or twice then. Now there's another lockdown. And when I heard them sing again after that 7 months, I realized it was just the most overwhelming thing. Incredible. I hadn't forgotten, but I mean, just to be standing out in front of it again and controlling it in a sort of way, but encouraging it, it was just too much.
Yeah. So we could say in a way that the Tallis Scholars is there to satisfy your aesthetic.
Well, if it starts with me, there's a decent chance it will go out to you.
Yes.
Collectively. Yeah.
As you know, I've been following the Tallis Scholars virtually for their entire existence. So
Well,
I can sympathize and empathize with that.
we first met in 1990, Nick.
No, we met before that. We met in the
Did we?
1980s in Paris.
Did we really?
Yes, yes. And you were interested in asking questions about how our founding director, Tony Petty, put together concerts.
Oh, yes. No, I was interested in him. Yes.
Yeah.
At one of the London colleges.
No, it was
Wasn't
in Paris, of all places.
It was in Paris.
Yes. That was our first meeting. And we then met in the late 1980s. That was after you had done your Russian recording.
Yes.
I was interested in that.
Yes. Yes.
For understandable reasons.
Yes.
So that was our second meeting. And then 1990 was here in Calgary.
Yes. Exactly. And yes.
One of the things that I'd like to ask you about is the repertoire. The Tallis Scholars repertoire has been focused almost exclusively on a cappella, sacred music of the European Renaissance, with occasional forays into early music, for instance, chant, and a handful of modern composers. John Taverner, who actually composed music for the Tallis Scholars, Eric Whittaker, whom you commissioned to write for you, and Arvo Pärt. And you have avoided reconstructions of particular historical events, and there are no obvious dramatic differences in your approach to pieces by composers from different geographic locations, for example, in the pronunciation of Latin or something like that. So the question is, to what extent are there differences in your approach to different composers or to different periods? And secondly, has your work with other choirs all around Europe and elsewhere changed your work with Tallis Scholars?
Well, in answer to the first part of that, I look at the Tallis Scholars like, and I encourage you to consider the Tallis Scholars like a keyboard instrument, not an organ, because the organ has all stops and different noises and bells and whistles, but a harpsichord is a good example. If a great player sits down at a harpsichord, the sound is fixed. He can change some interpretative nuances. I don't know what. I mean, ask a harpsichordist. But the sound, and indeed the tuning, is fixed. That choirs are not usually thought of like that. They're not. There's something sort of, I don't know, less easy to define about them. But I've always tried to make the Tallis Scholars into an instrument on which I can play, if you like. So given that background, you can't expect very great difference between a performance of a Spanish piece to an Italian piece. I mean, and what differences you might think are appropriate probably come from the 19th century anyway.
Yes.
Well, which gets back to the whole early music thing. I mean, we just don't know what choirs in Spain or Italy or England sounded like in the 16th century. We can never know. So, I mean, in a sense, I've been given carte blanche to do the sound that I want. And I personally find it satisfactory enough to apply that sound to different repertoires. And with the modern music, I just try to make them sound like Renaissance composers. And with Arvo Pärt in particular, that's extremely popular. He absolutely loves it. He told me he'd never heard anything. Well, he would say this because he's a nice chap, but he told me that the way we do his music to make it fit with Renaissance sound and style is exactly what he wanted, without knowing that he wanted it when he wrote the music. I find that the most tremendous compliment to the approach that I've just outlined.
Yes.
So I think the instrument of the Tallis Scholars is more or less a fixed sound, and that would explain why it hasn't changed very much over the years. And you're right to say, and I know it's true to say, that people can't tell which epoch the recordings come from. And I know this actually because we re-released the whole back catalogue some years ago, and no one had any idea which period these discs were coming from, including the modern ones, so I jumbled them all up. I can tell, but I'm in a rather special position. I know who was singing, and I know their voices. I know the weaknesses in their voices. I'm often dealing with the weaknesses in people's voices so that I can make the whole thing stronger. I don't mind that. I'm looking for trouble. And when I find it, I'm very sympathetic and ask, you know, for techniques to be improved, shall we say. Anyway, so I've got my instrument, and so I just this also goes back to the fads. I mean, at the beginning of the early music revival, it was a bit quite faddish business to change the pronunciation of the Latin. I mean, Jesus, what a bore that was. And it made no difference to the audience. It does make some difference to the sound of the music. I agree that if the vowel sounds are changed, then the melismas in the music will be inflected by the vowel sound. But what really matters is that the singers are giving a great performance, that they're going for it. You know, they're really involved with the excitement. What they don't want to do is remember some academic's opinion about how the French pronounced the letter A in the 1550s. And then they change their minds. That's what I call a fad.
Guilty as charged.
What a waste of time. I mean, what you want is a heartbreaking performance of a great piece of music by modern people who are going for it flat out on the stage in front of a crowd. And that's what your guys should be doing in the Calgary Renaissance Singers.
There will be some members who would be very pleased with that because they don't like this mucking around with sound.
Well, don't trip them up. All these fads are it's sort of academic people. Sorry, I love them really, but they keep changing their mind, coming up with some new idea which makes them important, rather than the performance which the choir is trying to give. Is that what you do?
I don't know. We have been known to err on that side, yes.
Oh, okay.
But that's all right.
You probably do. I don't know. I'm sorry. You probably do music that's not just polyphony. I mean.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. The moment you start singing, well, it wouldn't affect me, frankly. But I mean, if I was doing a Strauss motet or a Mendelssohn, you know that. Yeah.
In French chanson, it would be an example where.
Oh yeah, no. Well, you see, that's the secular art. Now we need to draw a distinction there.
Yes.
The secular repertoire doesn't involve us, and I mean it's difficult. Well, it's quite different. All the caveats that I make about sacred performance and the classic style and the tuning and the blend and go half out of the window with secular music, because it basically should be sung one voice to a part, and that changes everything.
It does.
And the words become far more on the surface of the music.
Can I come back to the second half of my question?
Yes.
Was you're working with choirs other than Tallis Scholars. Has this affected your approach to what you do with the Tallis Scholars, or are you?
No, because I mean, I love doing it and I learn a lot from them. But the fact is that they're employing me to try to create the Tallis Scholars out of them. And that's what I'm famous for, and that's what they want. I mean, they don't want me to flatten them, squash them, and make them into a sort of tiny little Tallis Scholars box shape. But at the bottom of it, they want the discipline that they hear in what we do with the tuning and the blend, which almost always they haven't naturally got. They don't work like that, those choirs. So I can't learn very much, to be honest. I mean, it'd be nice to say that I learned, it changed my life to conduct the Estonian Philharmonic Chamber Choir, which I who I work with quite a lot, and they're all fantastic. They've got Arvo Pärt sitting in the audience, you know.
Yes.
You know, they've taught me something, but they didn't want that. They wanted me to give them the sound that I represent, and I work hard to do that, and they love trying to do it. And so why try and deflect them?
I understand that, but I am curious about what you think you have learned from these choirs. Some of the things.
Oh, well, I mean, just purely from man management point of view, or crowd management, if you like, I've learned a lot, because you know, they're quite big, some of these choirs, 20 or 30 people. When I first worked with the BBC singers, they were at least 30 people, and they all had operatic voices. So that was a challenge for a young man.
Indeed.
That was my job in the, I think I started, I can't remember now, a long time ago. I had to knock them into some sort of shape, which they did, a shape they didn't want to be in, not those people. You've got to just, one thing we should talk about is the difference between the amateur world and the professional world, because they are markedly different.
Indeed, and I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
But perhaps what I could move on to now is, you have talked a lot about fads in early music as it has developed over the last 50 years. But I'm curious as to what you think might be the lasting elements of some of that over the last 50 years.
Well, that's very interesting, because we could also talk about the difference between the instrumental groups who got together at the beginning of the early music revival, and all that revolutionary spirit of authenticity, absolutely strict authenticity. As you had to be so authentic in the early days, otherwise you were accused of being hypocritical. Anyway, but you see, that wasn't possible with the choirs, with the singing. The instrumental groups could find the instruments and reanimate them, and blow into them, scrape them, whatever, and read the accounts, and it was quite clear that the symphony orchestras who were playing Corelli and Handel and so on at that time, or even Mozart and Beethoven, were producing a huge romantic sound which wasn't appropriate. Anyone could see that. So they got a lot of spotlight, a lot of work, a lot of recordings went out in the 70s and early 80s to record this new way of doing things that was sort of, it's like having all the dirty varnish stripped off the top of a painting. It suddenly revealed all the colors underneath. It was fantastic. It was a very necessary stage. But with the choral singing, that wasn't possible. There was well, it's happened much more slowly, the acceptance of it, that the ability to see that things have changed, because they've changed much more slowly in the singing world. Some people don't even notice that they have changed, but I know from having been there that over 50 years, the singing world also has stripped away the varnish and revealed the colors underneath, but it was a much less dramatic upfront process than with the instruments.
Yeah. I assume that among the things that you consider varnish in the vocal world would be things like vibrato and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, vibrato was at the bottom of it all, really. When I started in the early 70s, there were groups like the Clocks of Oxenford, and the reason why I can say that I said it early on was that it was such a breath of fresh air. But they were being compared with these sort of these institutional groups like the BBC Singers or the Dutch Chamber Choir, the radio choirs abroad, actually. In Spain to this day, almost all the choirs in Spain are still of that kind, of people who've been trained in the operatic tradition, haven't made it as an opera singer or haven't wanted to, and have come together to sing with other people in a choir. The chances of getting a good blend and good tuning out of people who start with that mindset are very limited. soloists don't want to sing with other people, and they've been taught to be soloists. I mean, yeah.
By the end of the 2020, the Tallis Scholars had given 2,330 concerts and released 65 original discs. There is obviously a vast difference, as you've mentioned, between the stress of recordings and the rigors of touring to virtually all corners of the world. I remember your first concert in Calgary in 1990. It was the last concert on the tour, and some of the singers seemed to be, should I say, a bit skittish at the thought of finally going home. Or I remember a concert in Edmonton, talking to one of your singers who was taking the overnight flight to London because he was supposed to be recording with another group the next day. How do you see the relationship between these two activities, the recording and the performing, and what for you are the pluses and minuses of each of those?
Yeah, well, of course, as you say, I mean, I've lived rather intensively in both camps, doing both things, I should say. One of the truths that the early music movement, I think, put an end to was that a recording ought to be the perfect concert performance without edits, with all the atmosphere of a great performance, just recorded and put on disc. There was a sort of romantic feeling that was the way discs should be made. And it didn't matter if there were mistakes or audience noise or aeroplanes, buses, the whole thing. But if the feeling in the hall at the time of the live concert had been that this was a great performance, then the best thing that could possibly happen to it was that it would go onto disc. I've always thought that was complete rubbish. Because the atmosphere of the moment is very quickly evaporates. And what you thought was fantastic actually wasn't quite as fantastic as you remember, because you were in a good mood at the time, and then you were in a bad mood the next morning when you actually come to listen to it the second time. Anyway, I've always taken the opposite view, that recordings are something quite by themselves, and they are a mechanical process, by and large, very, very arduous to do. But to get the best results, you've got to do it that way. You don't want outside noise. You certainly don't want mistakes. And you want, then you would ask reasonably, how do you get a great performance off a disc if it's also chip chop, you know? Well, it's possible. I don't quite know how. You've got to be sensitive. I have to be sensitive to how tired the singers are getting in the session and how tired they're getting with the little snippet that I made them sing 20 times. Not 20, but we have done 10 because of something, and it's something that I don't like. So, you know, and then what's presupposed after that is that you edit the thing, obviously very intensively. Quite a lot of the time you'll find that take 5 is probably the one that really gets going, because it's an artificial situation anyway. You're all standing there freezing cold in a church that's freezing, and there's no audience. There's just this wretched microphone and a voice on a box saying, "Do it again. It's no good." And me saying, you know, "Can't you do it? You know, can't you get that better?" I would say that if we didn't know the music inside out, probably the 5th or 6th take is the one that I'm going to listen to and probably put most of. I probably edit between takes 5 and 6. If we know the music really well, there's another problem altogether, which is that we're bored with it right from the start, and the recording situation won't help. I don't say bored. I mean, if it was a concert, we'd go for it.
Yes.
We you know, let's say Tallis' Lamentations, we've sung it 150 times, you know. If we were doing it tonight, we'd just go for it. We'd think, fantastic, we only have to sit, we just go straight through, and that's it, the end. The audience love it, had a wonderful time, thanks. But it's not like that on disc at all. And I'd like to tell you that the editing process is something that I've had to shape up to. It's a bit like editing films. You know how the great film directors would edit things for years sometimes, frame by frame, to get the best possible result from what he's recorded ages ago. Well, that's what I'm doing. And usually nobody has the time or the money to edit a music disc to that stage of refinement. But during lockdown, I have had that chance. And I've spent nearly a year editing a record of music by John Shepherd. And this will be the most edited record in the history of Renaissance polyphony, or anything possibly. And I remain to see whether anyone likes it. But I'm just getting so close to the ideal in a sort of way. And if you say it sounds stilted and mechanical and boring, you're entitled to say that, and I should be sorry, and I'll have wasted a year. But it's been a fascinating process, and I've always wanted to know whether it would work if I literally went frame by frame on every take, just like some of my favorite directors have done in the past.
Could I interrupt and ask then, when you re-release old discs, do you re-edit them?
A little bit. We have to digitalize some of them, I think.
Yes.
The very early ones were done analog. Once or twice I don't know how it's happened, I won't say where, but there was one record where there was a pitch change which slipped through the editing process, and I when we came to re-release it, I had another go. Sure, and it's gone, but it's right there on the original one. I'm not giving any prizes for anyone who spots this.
No, and I don't think I have my old LP, so I can't make the comparison.
Yeah, it probably was on the LP.
Yes. Yes. Touring, another story.
Yeah, well, now you see, I mean, the other side of the coin is dramatically different. Anyone can imagine that giving concerts is arduous in a quite different way. The exciting thing about concerts is that once you get to the stage, you've only got to all you got to do is give 100%. Just go for it. The thing will be over in an hour and a half. Just make the most of it, however tired you are. And, because with jet lag, we often give concerts on very bad jet lag, and you have to get used to how to deal with that. Then probably never ideal, but the exciting thing there is the sheer rush of adrenaline and just everyone together, wow. I love doing that, obviously. I mean, you only get one shot at it. It's the very opposite of recording. It's a one take moment, and the audience are right there, you see. Well, they were before this lockdown business. And they're supporting you. I mean, they've come to be entertained. Basically, it's an entertainment. And they want it to enjoy themselves. And you sing them a great piece like Tallis's Gaudi Gloriosa. And you whack them between the eyes, and everyone's as happy as anything. What's not to like about that?
Do you want to say a few words specifically about the Gaudi Gloriosa then?
Well, if you're going to play it, yes, I would like to. Well, you asked me to choose music from our recordings, obviously, and between us, we've managed to choose two pieces which were recorded about 30 years ago. We can now test because I never listened to those old recordings, so we can now test the theory of whether anyone can spot the difference between then and now. I can. But I'm very happy for people to hear this, and you can give me the feedback as to whether it sounds like the modern group, if you know what the modern group sounds like. If you want to know what the modern group sounds like, we've been recording a lot of Josquin des Prés for the anniversary this year, and these show how we sound now. But of course, Josquin's special repertoire, really, because he's not soprano, alto, tenor, bass. He's much more sort of baritone, loads of baritones. So it's not quite typical. certainly not with as typical as Gaude Gloriosa was.
Yes, yes. I mean, there are almost extremes there of sound as well as.
Well, let me explain with Gaude Gloriosa that okay, so we recorded this, I think, as early as 82, 3. I mean, it really is a long time ago. It's a piece that just it lasts nearly 20 minutes, and it's as long as a Haydn symphony, but it doesn't have movements, not really. There are some double bars where you stop, but you have to start again. No coughing and regrouping. You just the next section starts straight off. It's huge in every way. It's the ultimate challenge, really. It's high and low. It's particularly high. It depends what pitch you do it at. We used we still use high pitch. We like high pitch. So the top part is quite high. The challenge there is that if the top part is high, that you can hear all the counterpoint that's going on underneath it. And that was a challenge for the engineers, and still is. I'd like to play you the first. It's divided. 9 was one of those magical numbers, religious numbers, and it's divided into 3 groups of 3, making 9 sections overall. They all start with the word Gaude, rejoice. And I'd like you to hear the first 3 sections, so it's the first third of the piece, and it therefore has 3 sections within it, and it has a trio, a quartet, and then it builds into a full section, which is just magisterial beyond words. We can't do this piece very often in concert because it needs more than the 10 singers I normally have on the stage. It needs at least 12 singers. It's a 6-part piece, and really you need more than that just to help here and there. So it's quite expensive in our terms to do it. But I'm going to do it if I'm allowed to, I'm going to do it this year in Cadogan Hall in June, alongside Speminalium. So I'll have the singers there.
Indeed. Well, thank you and we look forward to hearing that first part.